we're going to talk about Chapter 4, Achieving 21st Century Learning Environments. And Chapter 4 addresses the differentiation between teacher-centered and student-centered learning strategies. It compares the advantages and limitations of 10 types of learning strategies. It talks a little about how to select technology and media that will facilitate learning experiences, and discusses the types of learning environments and settings that you might encounter in typical K-12 classrooms. It also talks about advantages and limitations of integrating free and inexpensive materials into instruction. The first thing we want to talk about today is the difference between teacher-centered strategies and student-centered strategies. If you turn in your chapter to page 70, you'll notice that the chapter talks about teacher-centered strategies and notes that teacher-centered strategies are those that are directed specifically by the teacher, and student-centered strategies are those in which the students are largely responsible for their own learning. So in the ASSURE model, which every letter is an acronym, it stands for something, a different step in the process, it helps you plan for how to approach every learning situation. And once you've analyzed the learners, stated your standards and objectives, selected the different aspects of your lesson and your strategies, the next step is to utilize those strategies and the materials that you've selected. It's during this utilize step that the teacher-centered strategies are implemented. Specifically, those are the teachers are the drivers who direct the learning in a very purposeful way. So when you use teacher-centered strategies, it's important to use appropriate types of activities for that. And if you look at the chart on the top of page 71, this gives you a list of some examples of when it's appropriate to use a teacher-centered strategy, like presentations or demonstration or drill and practice or tutorials. And then some potential types of technology or media that you might incorporate with that strategy. If you turn on over to page 72, you'll see the chapter discusses student-centered strategies. And remember, student-centered strategies are focused more on what the student is performing, the action that the student is doing, and taking responsibility for their own learning. And so also, just like with the previous chart, there is a chart for student-centered strategies and some of those types of activities like discussion, group games, discovery, problem-solving activities, and things like that. Now, the chapter goes on to discuss 10 different types of learning strategies. We're not going to talk about each one in depth, but if you've read your chapter, you have looked over, obviously, presentation, demonstration, drill and practice, tutorial, discussion, cooperative learning activities, games, simulations, discovery, and it finally wraps up with some talk about problem-based learning. And one thing that we do want to talk about are the limitations and the advantages of using free and inexpensive materials into instruction. In our class, under the Resources tab in Angel, you have access to a list of dozens of different types of free and inexpensive materials. Also, at the end of every chapter, the textbook lists all different types of resources for you. And with any type of resource that you use in the classroom, there are advantages and limitations. And I believe on page 86, the chapter discusses this. Some of the advantages of free and inexpensive materials are that they're from online resources. They can provide updated information, unlike books that can sometimes be outdated. Of course, websites can also be outdated, so you have to keep in mind of that. Also, in-depth treatment of a specific subject. So typically, free and inexpensive materials that are online can provide really in-depth information on a specific topic. Also, they can perform a variety of uses. Students can access open source applications outside of school. Audio-visual materials can be used for self-study or presentation, posters, charts, and maps. All of these different things can be combined to create different types of projects and activities. And then also student manipulation, in that the materials are expendable, so they have the advantage of allowing the learner to really engage in that without fear of whether it's going to be terribly expensive or whether they're going to ruin something. And then there are some limitations, because obviously there can be some bias, or sometimes there's advertising in web applications, Web 2.0 tools. Another limitation is that sometimes they promote special interests that you may or may not want to expose your students to, solicitation and things like that. And then also they're often limited in quantity. So whether that's a printed material from a supplier, or also limited access to a particular web app or website where there's information. They may give you like a light version. I know you've seen apps on your phones where you can download the free light version, but if you really want the good stuff, you got to pay for it. So sometimes you can work with the light version, and sometimes it's not enough. So keeping in mind there are pros and cons both ways. If you look at the chart on the top of page 87, this gives you some ideas for sources for free and inexpensive materials, and some of you have probably already thought of things like these, but public libraries, museums, government agencies, community organizations, these are all great places for accessing different types of materials that are free for your classroom. So that's going to wrap it up for Chapter 4.